Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from the bunker. And in this particular video, I want to move away slightly from Jehovah's Witnesses and deal with another religious group, namely the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which many of you will know as the Mormons, because there's been some interesting news in the last 24 hours. The LDS Church has reversed a 2015 policy and has said that children of same-sex couples can now be baptized, whereas they weren't previously. Now, whenever we're dealing with issues related to another religion, because it's outside of my knowledge, I like to speak to people in the know. And I thought, who better to speak to on this subject than my good friend, Jonathan Streeter. So thank you, Jonathan, for joining me all the way from Texas.
I'm glad to be here, Lloyd.
So what did you make of this announcement? We'll get into the nitty-gritty of it. I don't know whether I've portrayed it accurately. By all means, correct me. It seems like a step in the right direction, but I'm interested to know what you think as someone who knows the policies very well and also is able to put this in perspective in terms of the history of the church and the reforms that need to be made.
Well, I think you are correct in that it is a step in the right direction, but there's a caveat to that. And that is that it's kind of like if somebody, stabs you and puts you in a worse position and then pulls the knife out a little bit, so then expects a pat on the back. I mean, they've corrected what was a terrible policy decision made only 3.5 years ago and kind of put us back in around the same position that we were 3.5 years ago. But in the meantime, so much damage has been done. And the way that the institution has gone about this change is just kind of a business as usual for how it's gone about other hurtful policies in the past. The difference is that in the internet age, in the age where social media has us all connected and ideas flourish with a rapidity that you don't see anywhere else, we're seeing that take place on the span of years rather than decades. And that's, I think, it almost brings into stark contrast the root of the problem in a way that people on the outside can definitely see it, but it's still hard to be seen from people on the inside. And I can talk a little bit about what I mean by that.
Sure,
after
certainly.
we talk about what the policy actually is.
Well, what interests me about all this is because, and let me be absolutely clear, there are huge differences between the LDS Church and Jehovah's Witnesses. I think it's a little bit lazy. I'm not saying lazy, but it's definitely a mistake for people to kind of lump them together and say, oh, because they both evangelize on people's doorsteps, they must be the same thing. They're really not. But I do look at this from the viewpoint of, oh, this is what reform looks like, because we don't have that at all, really, in the Jehovah's Witness movement. So I'm interested to understand the process that's gone on here, so that if it were to happen with Jehovah's Witnesses, I'd be a bit more prepared. But just talk me through what in practical terms this change means. So as far as I'm aware, this is purely about the standing of same-sex couples in terms of whether they are considered apostates or not, and the ramifications of whether children of those couples can get baptized.
Yeah, in order to really understand it, you have to go back before 2015.
Right.
So if we look at the Mormon Church before 2015, there's a long-standing tradition of how they framed the issue of what they called same-sex attracted people. And that is that they considered homosexuality, and that's who they usually target their comments towards. They consider homosexuality to be a sin born of wickedness, meaning that you're gay because you masturbated, or you're gay because you engaged in viewing pornography and your appetite was never satiated, and so you got more and more explicit in your pornography. You wanted more and more thrills, and eventually that warped your mind and warped your spirit to the point that you became homosexual. And that is the type of narrative that you see reflected in books written by past apostles. For example, Spencer W. Kimball was one of our prior apostles. He was actually the prophet when we reversed the policy on blacks in the priesthood, which I think we've talked about before, but he still had this narrative for homosexual people. Now, if you take that backdrop of this is how the church treats this issue, then imagine now that we understand that homosexuality is not something that somebody consciously chooses to become or is part of a pathway of iniquity involving more extreme forms of pornography, but is simply a way somebody is born. We know that in that era, when people were growing up with that messaging, people were having to deal with the conflict between their reality and what the religion was telling them. And in Mormonism, and I think this is where some of the similarities happen, is that the worldview that you hold as a Mormon is shaped by the message that the leaders give you. So these people that were gay, that were dealing with the reality of their own individual existence, were overlaying the framework that the prophets were giving on them. And they felt broken, they felt wicked, because this is the message that was told them. If you are gay, then you are wicked. And frequently they would go to their church leaders and say, I'm struggling with this issue. And this is where we get into the weeds of the debris that we're seeing now. Because when somebody came to a bishop or to a stake president and said, I have attractions for others of my same gender, then we saw that those leaders told them, well, this is fixable. And there's a period of time where if you were at BYU and this was happening, then you would undergo conversion therapy, which involved, as we hear, survivors.
Just to be clear, BYU is Brigham Young University.
That's correct. Yeah, that's the church-owned university that all aspiring Mormons try to get to. So if you were in that environment, they had a research department that would take you through a conversion therapy process, which may have involved hooking electrodes up to your genitals and subjecting you to forms of erotic images, both homosexual and heterosexual, and then trying to attach a negative stimulus to homosexual imagery in a way to use what we understand are very barbaric, almost torture-like methods to try to reprogram your brain.
Well, not almost. It is torture, isn't it? To be electrocuted.
Yeah. And to be fair, Mormons weren't the only ones that were delving into this dark side of what they saw as mental illness treatment. But Mormons did engage and endorse it at the time, and they felt that it reflected their understanding of the nature of this issue. But that aside, the other side, and this is where we really get into what the repercussions we're feeling now are, is that they would tell members, if you just marry somebody of the opposite gender, it will all work out. You just need to have a normal, wholesome, heterosexual experience, and your body and your mind will conform to the way that you should be, because God's plan is for eternal families in the heteronormative way in Mormonism. And so we see now thousands of families that started out with the mother or the father, and it's usually the father, having been gay, going through the motions to find a woman, become married, and start a family while struggling with the reality of their homosexuality. And then a decade later, when we go into the era where now we're starting to understand homosexuality more, these families are ripped apart because the father can no longer, or the mother, the person who's in a mixed orientation marriage, and possibly and likely secretly in that marriage, the family blows apart because trying to hold those two grounds is just such an internal conflict that it's impossible. But in the meantime, there are children that have resulted from this. And so that is kind of the backdrop that the Mormon Church was in 2015. We were seeing a lot of divorces that were happening where you may be a child and your father has divorced your mom and come out as gay and is starting to enter into relationships with other men because that is now not a taboo in society, and it's something that people can do more openly. And then it leads up into all the conversation that if you're in America and other parts of the world, you've heard about the struggle to acknowledge and recognize legally gay marriage. And that comes to a head a little bit before 2015, when the Supreme Court legalizes same-sex marriage for the United States. And keep in mind that in the lead up to this...
So that played a part, do you think? So,
yeah.
So the societal pressure for there to be less of a stigma surrounding same-sex marriage made the LDS Church react in such a way as to say, no, we're going to put our foot down on this.
Right. And when we look at the way they explain this policy, they are very open about this is why we're doing it. But
right.
You know, in the meantime, leading up to that change, the church itself had been involved in several different states trying to change state constitutions to codify marriage between one man and one woman when that constitution was ambiguous before. And so we saw that in Hawaii, and we saw it in California with something called Proposition 8, where the church used its influence to have members both within the state of California as well as throughout the entire nation. If you were a Mormon, the church leaders came and said, hey, you can donate to this cause and we'll help end gay marriage in California. And, you know, I think a lot of those local state efforts, some were met with success. I believe in California, it was later reversed. And each state was struggling with that issue. And that's kind of when things got elevated to the Supreme Court. And we are at the position where same-sex marriage is now recognized across the nation. And the church and its leaders are sitting there saying, well, we've got now to deal with this, and we have to make sure we establish that God's laws are above man's laws. And so even
this was under Monson's presidency.
That's correct, yeah. Even though the world is declaring same-sex marriage should be okay, we need to be clear and unambiguous to our members that same-sex marriage is not okay. And they're still treating the physical act of homosexuality, sexual relations between same-gendered people as a severe iniquity. And then furthermore, the idea of gay marriage is an affront to God's plan. Because in Mormonism, our view of eternity is a network of relationships sealed by marriage under priesthood authority. And that is for the purpose of creating more spirit progeny. And that can only be done with a heterosexual coupling. And so there is no room in the metaphysical universe of Mormonism for homosexual relationships because they don't produce progeny. And so all of this is kind of the background. So in 2015, the policy comes out. And what is the policy exactly? Well, the policy states that if any member of the church is married, is grounds for a disciplinary hearing, which they kind of soften the blow by saying, you simply have to hold a hearing, but we're not going to tell your local leaders what the outcome is. But we understand, because of how they've taught about the issue of homosexuality, that the outcome should be excommunication. And so it categorized the act of being in a gay marriage and living a homosexual life in that way as apostasy. And you have to understand that apostasy is something reserved for there's doctrinal, theological things, such as, you know, teaching something as doctrine when it's not doctrine. This is where you get offshoots that try to lead people with them as other leaders, and putting this thing for people who would otherwise be normal members of the church, supportive members of the church, that just happen to be gay and choose to live their life just as fully as somebody who's not gay, kind of lumping them in that category. Now that's the first part of it, is if you're married and you're gay, then you're an apostate and you will be subject to discipline. And then the other thing is, if you're a child and your parents, one of your parents or the parent that you're living with is gay and is married to a same gender person, then you are not allowed to get baptized. You're not allowed to be confirmed, which in Mormonism means that priesthood leaders lay their hands on your head and confer upon you the gift of the Holy Ghost, which the thing that was, we'll talk about this baptism and confirmation. Those are both very important things in Mormonism, in your life as a Mormon, because they bind you to the church. They give you a connection with God, a connection with Christ and with the divine and the Godhead that they talk about a lot as something that is empowering, is protective, and is an important part of being a Mormon. So to shut out children who themselves are not gay, it's just that their parents have, creates a big theological problem when you look at other ways that the Mormon Church talks about personal agency. But then on top of that, to shut them out of God's blessings in terms of baptism and the gift of the Holy Ghost makes no sense at all. And so it caused a lot of mental strife and anguish for people trying to understand the issue, for people who had children who were gay. But the effect of it, now remember a moment ago we talked about how we have these mixed orientation marriages that happened because leaders were telling gay men and women, just get married to the opposite gender, it'll all work out. And a decade later, it doesn't all work out. We've got a family blown apart with children. So now we've adopted this policy where the children of gay married people cannot advance in the church. And we've got hundreds or thousands of families where the children, maybe it was a lesbian mother who was in a mixed relationship before, the divorce happened, the mother has custody, and then the mother marries another woman because of the same-sex marriage ruling of the Supreme Court. Well, now you have a child who, in all likelihood, is still going to church, particularly if they live in Utah, Arizona, Idaho. These are states in America that have a high concentration of Mormon communities. They may still be going to church because that's where their friends are. That may still be their vocabulary of spirituality. And even if they have gay parents, it's not unheard of for the gay parents, even if they're gay married, to still want to be connected to the church because they have extended family that are there. That's the faith community that they've known. That's where they feel most comfortable, even with all of the conflicting messages and the difficulty of Mormonism. But what it does is it totally locks the children out of advancement in that community because they can't get baptized, they can't get confirmed. There's a whole sexism issue about only men getting the priesthood, but if you're a young man in the church, you're not advancing along the cultural landmarks of the faith because you've been blocked out of advancement because of that.
But this has now been reversed, and just so that I can understand the ramifications of this decision, are we now in a situation where, because when I think of this issue, especially as it pertains to Jehovah's Witnesses, there's a whole lot of homophobia intrinsic in the Jehovah's Witness religion. They are biblical fundamentalists. They take very seriously the idea that homosexuality is a sin. And they even go so far as to produce both video and written propaganda aimed at stigmatizing people in that situation.
With Caleb and Sophia, right?
Indeed, the famous Caleb and Sophia cartoon is just one example of many that they've been on almost a crusade over the past couple of years. In Mormonism, am I right in saying that if you are a gay Mormon, you could now enter into a gay marriage, a same-sex marriage with someone that you've met and not be excommunicated?
It's complicated. And let me tell you why. Okay.
Usually is, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Well, if you've studied organizations that some people call cults, other people say are high-demand fundamentalist religions, you'll note that there's this concept called indirect directives, where the leaders say one thing, but if you have a full understanding of what they've said,
we call it theocratic warfare in Jehovah's.
Is that what okay, yeah. Well, they'll say something to one audience where words mean one thing, and particularly if it's the outsiders they're talking to. But then when they're in an audience of insiders, they'll say something else, and as an outsider, if you're paying attention and you have an ear in both of those venues, you can sort of get a sense of what they're doing. But it's hard when you're inside. Your mind always tends to just interpret what they want you to interpret in a particular context. But this is the problem, okay? So we just talked about how the policy affected people. When that hit and families had to realize that, okay, even though in the Bible Christ told his apostles to not bar children from coming to him, the church now acting in the name of Christ is actually barring children from coming to him. It doesn't make sense. Even though Joseph Smith, in one of the Articles of Faith, which is a concise articulation of the tenets of our faith, said that men are punished for their own sins and not for Adam's transgression. We interpreted this to mean that each person would only receive punishment for things they themselves did. And so the idea of punishing children who are innocent for the fact that their parents are gay, it just doesn't make theological sense. But all of this was considered very, very real, because when the policy came out in 2015, it was followed up by leaders making statements, one of which was the person who is currently the prophet, Russell M. Nelson, who was the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles at that time, which is kind of like a second tier of leadership below the first presidency, which is the highest tier of leadership. He stated in a conference that the entire group of leaders were all together when the prophet at the time, Thomas Monson, declared the will of the Lord, which was this policy, and they all felt a spiritual confirmation of it. So this is the equivalent of your governing body saying, God told us to do this, and we all felt the voice or felt the presence of Jehovah, and so all the members, because they needed to hear that it was from God, because it was such a controversial thing, because people couldn't make sense of it. It seemed to conflict with all these other gospel ideas. And so we've been struggling. So those of us outside of the church felt like a change like this wasn't really going to be possible, because they had sealed the policy with the very word of God, the very voice of God in that declaration.
You can't backtrack without basically admitting that you didn't hear.
Exactly. But well, that's the idea. You would think, well, the church, when they did that, they were like in for a penny, in for a pound.
Yeah.
And we felt like the reason it took decades for the issue of race to be changed was because the leaders realized that if they reversed it, people would realize, wait a second, God is not supposed to change. You've been telling us that God is constant and that you're the mouthpiece of God. And so if you're going to change things like this, well, why didn't God just not do it in the first place? And I think this is where a lot of us on the outside are like,
that's just proof that it's a man-made religion.
Exactly. Yeah. And we're like, this is number one, it is a good move. It's a move in the right direction, because it takes away the intensity of the stigma that people who are struggling with this issue have, and that families trying to connect with their loved ones have. But when you talked about homophobia, one of the things, if you look at the verbiage that the new announcement has, and this is a common thing that you have when you look at how the church changes things, they made allusion to how the goal of the leaders, the brethren, the prophets and apostles, is to promote love and unity. And it's really because the members have been hateful and bigoted, and we're trying to help the members overcome that hate and bigotry. And that's why we're making this change in a positive direction. And so
blame it on the members.
They're blaming the members a little bit. They're saying, well, and you can look at the whole span and you could say, well, there's a biblical precedent where the children of Israel begged God for a king, and they said, no, we don't want a king. And then they begged him more, and God said, okay, fine, you can have a king. Well, that is the type of narrative that I would not be surprised happens behind closed doors with these apostles, is that, well, we know what the truth is and what the right is, but the church members at large aren't ready for that. So we're just going to, give them what they want, but we understand what the real truth is. And that whole we understand what the real truth is where you see the problem, because in the language of this new policy reversal, correction, or update, they've not only invoked the idea of revelation again, they've said now that this is a greater understanding and revelation of the will of God. So now we're saying God told us to do this new change. But on top of that, we still hold homosexual relations to be a serious transgression. And I think that's probably going to play out in the future, because in the past they've called it a sin and now they're calling it a transgression. And in Mormonism, there's a difference between a sin and a transgression. But it's still a serious transgression, but we're not going to consider it apostasy. So we're not going to immediately trigger a disciplinary council. But there's a problem, because what they're saying is that they're going to treat sexual relations between same gender and sexual relations between mixed gender the same in terms of the law of chastity. And the law of chastity in Mormonism is articulated in the temple. And recently there was a temple change which changed the verbiage of the law of chastity. Previously, it referred to husbands and wives and men and women in the law of chastity, and that they were not allowed to have sexual relations with anyone other than their husbands or wives, to whom they were legally and lawfully wedded. Well, now that it's legal and lawful to be gay married, they had to change that. And the new temple verbiage takes out reference to husband or wife altogether. And it simply says that the sons and daughters, the men and women of God's kingdom, are not to have sex unless they're married according to God's law. And so that whole according to God's law thing
fascinates me, because that is a change to some quite spiritually profound verbiage that is a direct result of legislation in what would be considered by Jehovah's Witnesses as Satan's system of things. So absolutely. Jehovah's Witnesses would be mortified at the idea of their beliefs and their religion having to capitulate to something that's happened. And this is why, by the way, this is partly why there's such a problem with child sex abuse cover-ups, is because the organization absolutely refuses to be perceived to be bending to outside standards when it comes to child sex abuse. They view the Bible standard as final, and they cannot budge on that. So just the very notion of the LDS Church changing the text of sacred rituals to you know, as a response to a change in the law in America, I just find that astonishing.
No, you're absolutely right. And, you know, we have a handbook of instructions, which is kind of a layer removed from Scripture. And that's kind of the policies and procedures. It makes reference to Scripture for each of its policies and procedures, but it's articulated in modern verbiage. It's formatted like a modern instruction manual. I believe you guys have a similar parallel document that only the leaders have access to, which governs how a local unit is run. Is that true?
Yeah, well, there's different documents. So there's letters to bodies of elders, there's the shepherd book, which is for elders, and then there's various manuals for the branches and what have you. Right. But yeah, you have eyes only documents.
Right, and that manual is what, as members, we would expect would change to adopt, you know, secular policies, laws, and things like that, because that's something that's made to govern. You know, it's made under the leadership. In today's language, it's a modern product. But to have it change Scripture would be very different. But in Mormonism, the temple is like the most sacred place. It's the house of God. And so changes there, as you mentioned, are very dramatic. But with these changes, they've normalized the idea of change. There's a little preamble that they put in the temple that said, you know, changes will be constant. Whereas in the past, they've always, you know, when Joseph Smith, the founder of the religion, articulated this temple ceremony, he specifically said this should never be changed. And the whole idea of what the Mormon Church is as a restored religion is that changes have happened over the centuries from Christ's original church through the Catholic Church and all the offshoots. And so now we're going to go back to its original form. And the idea is you don't want it to change, because then you're going to follow the same path of the great apostasy. But what we're seeing today with this policy certainly is more change in that theme of greater light and knowledge, greater understanding. You mentioned the idea how this represents reform. Before I get to that, I do want to make sure
just to go back before you do that. I'm interested to know, because you said it was complicated, but can you, as a Mormon, enter into a same-sex marriage and things continue as normal?
The act of being married is not a trigger for a disciplinary hearing. That is what is clarified by this policy. Now, what is not
it's the
clarified,
consummation of the marriage, is it?
exactly, because if you look,
right.
the church is very legalistic.
That's sneaky, isn't it?
And so if you're married and you're in a heterosexual marriage and you commit adultery, then it is the act of the engaging in the iniquity that will be the trigger for a disciplinary hearing. But if you're gay married and then you engage in homosexual sex act, that is the same level of iniquity or the breaking of God's law as adultery. And
well, in that sense, there's very little change, isn't there? Because either you're allowed to be gay or you're not. It seems, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, it seems to me that this change is a technicality that allows children of gay couples to get baptized. But when it comes to whether you are allowed to be gay or not as a Mormon, it seems to me that nothing has changed. You're not allowed to be gay in any meaningful sense, because either you, in for a penny, in for a pound, either you are allowed to be fully in a romantic relationship as a gay person or you're not. And you're telling me that you're not.
I think if you drill down and you hold members to every letter of the law, you're not. But what I think in practice, just the fact that the church has said we're not going to excommunicate gay married couples, I think what is going to happen is that bishops, which are the level that would initiate any disciplinary councils, will see gay married couples and they will say that's okay. And they won't pry into what happens in the bedroom. There'll be this kind of don't ask, don't tell. We just won't confront the issue. Yeah, we won't confront the question of whether or not you're engaged in homosexual sex as a married couple. We'll just
pretend that you're not.
Now the question though is, if you're a man in a homosexual marriage, can you hold the priesthood, which would grant you the ability to participate in certain ordinances, to hold leadership callings? And that question, I think, is where we'll see the difference. Prior to these policies, if you were gay, it was okay for you to be in the church, but you had to be celibate. And that was in line with not accepting gay marriage. So if they've now accepted gay marriage in that it doesn't specifically exclude you, what do we do with the fact that if you're gay married, then you're likely not celibate? And that's where we'll start to see that happen. And they have not, all we have right now is a concise statement by one of the leaders summarizing a more expansive conversation that happened in a leadership conference leading up to the general conference this weekend. And I think we will see in what is given at the general conference, as well as things that are released afterwards, if they provide more detail that can fill in these gaps about all of these questions that happen. I think immediately the greatest effect is going to be that when the policy came out in 2015, it reinforced the negative thoughts that particularly young people dealing with homosexuality had that would lead to things like suicide, that would justify families in doing a soft form of shunning if they adopted the church's position. Fortunately, we see that a lot of members did not simply adopt the church's position, but almost became more vocal, critical of it, and yearning for the church to do better. There are groups such as the Mama Dragons, which is a group of mothers of gay children who have decided to be more outspoken in defense of their children. We've seen other allied groups try to give voice to this cause, to encourage the church to change. And we're feeling like the fact that the church has changed is a result of all of those positive voices that have tried to encourage it to do that. But it has so much further to go, because even though we are no longer demonizing gay marriage the way that we used to and all of the repercussions on the children, we still have not given affirmation for gay people to feel complete and whole as individuals and in God's good graces. If they are gay in the church, they still are given the idea that there's something wrong, something that needs to be fixed about them. And there's no theological space for them to have a fully fulfilled life and have hope for salvation or exaltation in the highest degree of glory. And so the church has adopted in the most recent conference last October, the very leader who came out and announced this change just yesterday said, you know, there are people who are unwilling or unable to keep all of God's commands, and God has prepared lesser kingdoms of glory for them. And so the church is kind of setting up a multi-layered heaven, which we've always had, you know, 3 kingdoms of glory, but that almost just said, you know, if you're gay and you choose to live that gay style, that's okay. You're just not going to be in super VIP heaven. You're going to be in, you know, you're going to be in like Kmart heaven or something, you know, a lesser heaven. And, you know, I think that messaging is not going to fly in the long term. So we're just seeing the gradual, the way the church changes and reforms.
So what I'm hearing is that, you know, it's a step in the right direction, at least in terms of, because I'm thinking from the perspective of someone who's living with this dilemma of being attracted to the same sex, but being raised in this religious environment where that's frowned on, and how awkward and uncomfortable that must be, to put it mildly. So I'm guessing that just the fact that there's been some movement on this must be slightly affirming and slightly encouraging. But you're telling me that there's much more progress to be made. But it's encouraging that there has been at least some progress, and that I think is a key difference between the LDS Church and Jehovah's Witnesses, where they are static. There is the level of change is glacial in speed. You do see, for example, in the issue of child sex abuse, you see microscopic change in their policy, but the main issues stay unaltered, again, because they would view any form of reform as being almost a signal that they were doing things wrong. And this takes us back to what we were saying originally, which is, how do you change as a religion claiming revelation from God without admitting that you weren't receiving revelation from God to begin with?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but in Mormonism, we have this notion of greater light and knowledge. So anytime they do a change which directly contradicts something before, the leaders will say, well, we've had a new revelation, we have greater light and knowledge, this is a higher understanding of God's will, and the members buy it. They're like, oh, well,
so you have sense. Greater light, we have new light.
Okay, yeah, see, there you go.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the framework is there, but I think even on a psychological level, the power of the indoctrination, and this is where maybe where the Jehovah's Witness leaders just haven't figured out that the power of their indoctrination is so overwhelming that they can do whatever they want and members will fall in line.
You see, you say the framework is there. I don't think the framework is there, because when you really think about what the new light or greater light doctrine means, it means that in the past, wrong information was being given to God's worshippers on earth. And there's no, certainly in the Bible, I don't know about the Book of Mormon, but in the Bible, there's no scriptural precedent for the Creator to hand down misleading information to achieve a certain objective. It just isn't there in the Bible. So you're either calling God a liar or you're not. But I agree with you that organizations like the LDS Church and Jehovah's Witnesses perhaps to some degree underestimate just how much control they've got, so that they don't necessarily have to explain things. For example, the overlapping generation teaching is a good example of a teaching that just makes zero logical sense. They don't have to come up with these convoluted explanations, because literally they have so much control over people's minds. They could come up with anything and the followers would swallow it.
Absolutely. I mean, and I'm listening to you explain how the Bible doesn't ever have God. There's no justification. It doesn't matter. I mean, I think George Orwell, when he articulated the concept of doublethink, where people in the web of indoctrination can hold two absolutely contradictory and conflicting ideas in their mind at the same time, believe both of them, then we see it every day in these high demand groups where you could say, yes, God never changes. Here is God's most recent change. And there's no problem. It's okay. You know, I caught a lot of criticism in the Mormon community and then the ex-Mormon community last year when I created a satirical website which posed as the leaders of the church making an apology for the history of racism. And
Naughty, Jonathan. That's just so scandalous. How dare you?
Well, I wanted to give an idea of what it might look like if the church did the right thing. But it turned out to be a little bit of a social experiment, because I think critics of the church felt like, well, if the church ever did something that was such a 180 shift from its statements in the past, which included, we do not give apologies, then it would just blow people's minds. They would say, wait a second, the prophet is clearly making all this up. I'm leaving the church. Well, what we saw when that came out in this brief window of time where people believed that it was real was that people who were faithful members of the church, it actually increased their faith in the church. It increased their reverence for the prophet. People who were articulating it felt more proud to be Mormon, even though the church was acknowledging a very severe fault. And I think this is because it aligned with what people understand to be the right thing to do. And so it was much easier for them to envision their church doing it. And to me, that was just a peek behind the curtain of the degree of influence that the organization has over the members, where they can do whatever they want. They can reverse something in the past, and members will still find that the leaders are their prophets. They are willing to continue to follow them. And so that's why, on the outside, we're pointing at this and we're saying 3 years ago, God said one thing, and now 3.5 years later, God's saying something completely different. Why didn't God just do that? We've got kids who are dead now because of this. This put them over the edge into suicide. And now the church is just reversing it as though it was nothing. Why in the world? And so we're looking to see, what are the rationalizations? What are the explanations that are going to come out about why the world, the church, needed to go through these 3 years of torment with this policy that wreaked havoc across the members' lives, tore down the reputation of the church, and now we're just going to go back to the way that it was before.
So are you hoping for more explanation at the forthcoming, is it General Assembly?
I think they have to explain the details doctrinally. They are not going to apologize. They're not going to acknowledge.
No, they never apologize, do they?
They are complicit in the dead kids who committed suicide over this. They're not going to acknowledge that they're complicit in the families that were devastated. And people who saw this change back in 2015, and that woke them up to the state of the church and the absent foundation of its leaders, they're going to simply characterize those people as those who lost the faith. And they can appeal to all sorts of biblical references about separating the wheat from the tares and the goats from the sheep. And so more progressive Mormons who see the disconnect between God's love and what the church is doing and distance themselves and leave the church will be seen as good riddance. And, that can only last so long until, we realize that the entire youthful generation of the church is growing up in the world. They have good friends who are gay. They understand that those friends are good people and that they should and deserve to have real fulfilled lives. And if the church does not change its position, they're just going to themselves separate more from the church. And we're seeing that trend with the millennial generation and younger. The church is retaining fewer and fewer percentage of them with each subsequent generation, because there's such a disconnect between what the church is doing and the reality of the world that we live in.
Indeed. Well, Jonathan, I wanted to understand this issue more fully. I looked to you for guidance on this and a bit of perspective, and you definitely haven't disappointed. So thank you so much for...
Well, I want to encourage, before you get to that, I want to encourage your viewers, if anyone, if you have connections with individuals who themselves have been affected by this issue. I left the church before any of these issues happened, and so a lot of my exposure is just as an outsider's perspective. And I think that you will get a more meaningful and a more deep personal understanding of it if you talk to somebody who was gay and Mormon, or somebody whose family was deeply affected by this, and I think you'll get an even more complete understanding. So I definitely want to encourage your viewers to do that if they have the opportunity.
Sure. What resources would you recommend for anyone watching this who happens to be a gay Mormon and really struggling with this kind of existential issue, really?
Yeah, there's a Facebook group and a webpage called Mormons Building Bridges, which is a group of people that are really trying to promote a positive change in how the church handles this issue. I think the group Mama Dragons also is in that circle of people who are just fierce advocates for giving full dignity to members of the church that are affected by how the church is teaching the issue of homosexuality.
Wonderful. So there are resources available, and as we said, there's definitely more scope for improvement in this area. So there's certainly more scope with Jehovah's Witnesses, that they've not even flinched on this. But it is encouraging to see more of a focus on this in general in society, which at least in the case of the LDS Church is filtering down into changes in policy, it seems.
Mormonism is a more effective virus. We change and adapt quicker than Jehovah's Witnesses, so we can.
You're more interested in becoming mainstream. That's what it is, which could be argued is you're kind of a sellout. You know, we're hardcore, we're fundamentalists. We don't flinch at all.
We have $30 billion in the stock market, so we're doing fine.
Yeah. Viewers who haven't seen our Three Apostates podcast on the Chris Shelton channel won't perhaps be familiar with this, but yeah, we do tend to be a bit competitive when it comes to comparing our former religions. So Jonathan, again, thank you so much for joining me and helping me understand this issue better.
Anytime, Lee.
So viewers, I hope you have enjoyed this conversation. It certainly helped me get more of a grasp on this issue. Please don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you so much for watching.
Oh,